Afternoon, everyone. It's Ken Kim with Ken Kim Analytics. Hope everyone's having a great weekend. Today, I just want to talk about Georgia and the history of Georgia, but then also the projections I have. And so, right away, I'll just talk about the state of Georgia as it was once a Republican stronghold that votes similar to its neighboring states, for example, like Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee. But in recent times, it's become more of a competitive state. And today, I want to go over what has changed from a non biased statistical standpoint. And right off the bat, I'm just gonna mention how Georgia it is becoming a black mecca of the U.S. And you're gonna see why I'm gonna be talking so much about demographics when it pertains to Georgia and what makes it an anomaly compared to some of the other swing states, but then also to some of the states in the southeast. So right off the bat, I'm gonna reference some things from Pew Research. For example, black eligible voters drove nearly half of the Georgia's electoral growth since the year 2000. But then also too, Georgia has been getting a lot of migration in terms of black eligible voters from not just within the U.S. but just from all over African countries, the Caribbean, but then all from the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West. And then we also see from Brookings they have similar data where they found out that in this sense of where black migration is coming from the Northeast, about 50% of African Americans that move from the Northeast, as well as almost the West, and kind of close to the Midwest as well, are moving to the South. And Atlanta has been the number one city. And as we can see here, from 1995 even to now, Atlanta has been the top destination in terms of African American migration. Whereas you see in the white column, it's been a little bit more of a mixed bag. And you see here, Brookings, another study here, we see that African Americans tend to vote not as reliably Republican compared to their counterparts. For example, Native Americans, they actually surprisingly vote a little bit more Republican than, say, Latino Americans. And Latino Americans vote a little bit more Republican than Asian Americans. But then African Americans are usually the ones that vote the most Democratic. And this is just comparison from 2018 to 2022. And the reason I'm going to talk about some of the social issues now, as you can see here, we have the abortion chart where we have in polling that's coming from Pew Research study, they found that 60% of the white Americans that they polled did believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. But then African American, you see that spikes up to 73, and that is almost as high as Asian Americans, which is almost at 80%. And the reason why I kind of want to just touch on the topic of abortion a little bit is just because of the fact that it was a very big talking point in the year 2022. And you notice that if you looked at election day results, there were a lot of red states that did vote on legalizing abortion, but even in states like Kansas, for example, that haven't really voted Democrat in decades, yet they elected a Democrat governor. You saw on the 2022 ballot, 100 to 200,000 people, roughly around, voted in a Democratic primary for U.S. Senate and governor for two of the biggest races. But then on that same ballot, almost 600,000 people voted for legalized abortion, which kind of sheds the light that there are a lot of pro-choice Republicans and pro-choice independents that may lean Republican, that a lot of people in other regions of the U.S. may realize. And then also one thing that didn't help was when you saw situations where, for example, unfortunately, that 9-year-old girl that got raped in Ohio, and then she had to get an abortion in the state of Indiana instead of Ohio just because of the restrictive abortion laws. And I will not be portraying my own opinions on that, but I do know that fortunately, the timing, what happened was it was right after Roe v. Wade got overturned, and you saw that there was lower turnout in a lot of the Midwest states, in some of the rural areas, just because of how people felt that the GOP and some of these pro-life organizations kind of handled that situation. And in terms of swing states, Georgia was really the only swing state out of the six: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, that was actually a Bible Belt state. So they didn't really get a good perspective on the output that abortion was going to have impact-wise with Roe v. Wade getting overturned. And I just want to go over some issues that African Americans got polled from Pew Research said were a big priority. Obviously, racism, police brutality, economic inequality. economic inequality doesn't surprise me too much. For example, you look at a lot of prominent black leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. You look at his speech where he talks about the three evils of society. He actually mentions how capitalism was built on the backs of black slaves. But then also too, I also try to look at it from a black perspective. Even though I'm not an expert on African American matters, I do acknowledge that even though slavery has been gone for a long time, there are still some baby boomer and silent generation African Americans today that still live through segregation and still heard the stories of slavery from their grandparents who lived through it. So I do understand that there is some sort of aspect in that regard. And then obviously there's affordability of healthcare, uh, voting, quality schools, especially too during the segregation times. A lot of African Americans were not getting equalized schooling compared to like some of their other counterparts, like the white counterparts. And so, but the thing with 2024 is economy and healthcare was a top issue for black voters coming into the presidential election. Also, too, you also had racial inequality, crime, and just this is also another chart that just talks about how the black eligible percentage of voters is going up. And you're going to see, as I talk about Georgia, it is not always weighted equally. So black voters are about 40% of the vote now. And in terms of raw numbers, they're about 34.4 million people now in that regard. And I just want to go over Hispanics as well. Hispanics, they prioritize economy, education more, but they do still care about things like immigration. And on the stance of abortion, different Hispanic groups have different opinions. Mexicans are almost kind of evenly 50-50 split, but you look at groups like Cuban Americans, they're actually some of the most pro-choice, the Latin American groups. And with Asian Americans, here we have Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese. Inflation was a big concern, but a lot of Asian Americans, they do care about things like economic inequality, racial discrimination, climate change, some of these issues that may not have been as big of a priority for the GOP that they should watch out for. And right now, I'm going to go over the demographic changes, and it's going to start making sense why I'm talking about these demographic changes now. So you see in this map, this is for white voters. Across the US, you see that white population is going down in almost every state. So like the darker the yellow, the bigger percentage loss in white population. And then so you see like Nevada is having some of the biggest ones. You see that with Texas not to the extent, and same thing with Florida. So white percentages are going down across the board. With Hispanics are going up. For the most part, it's pretty tame percentage wise. You're seeing a little bit of density with Illinois, a little bit in the Northeast, Florida, Texas, the border states, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California is where you're really starting to see like a heavy density in that regard. And then Asian Americans, surprisingly, there's a lot of states that just haven't changed. I mean, Asians are not making up the U.S. electorate like Hispanics, blacks, and whites. And the biggest change you see is mostly in California. California is the one where it has the dark green. And now I'm going to bring up African Americans. As you can see on this map, there's actually a lot of states that aren't changing or actually losing black population. There are some that are starting to gain a little bit, but there's only one state on this map that's having an influx of African American migration, and that is the state of Georgia. And so now that you've seen the maps, you see that Georgia was the only state that had a significant rise, which backs the data that Brookings found. And even though the minority groups all across the board are growing, some are still not a significant percentage of the electorate in some of these states. For example, in 2020, Asian Americans made up less than 2% of the total voters, while Hispanics were less than 10%. So white and African Americans are still the dominant voting groups for the state of Georgia. And you look at how people like to say, oh, this candidate turned off these voters, or this candidate turned off the suburbs and whatnot. But when you look at the graph, that's interesting. With whites and blacks in particular, there's been almost no movement whatsoever since 1994 for black voters. And white voters, there was a dip during the 90s, during Clinton years, and then also too during the Obama years, where whites were getting a little bit more Democrat. But then during the 2020s, and even before, it was starting to go back to almost the same exact rate that it was at in 1994, which is 55, 56% Republican, 42, 41% Democrat. And you see it like the performance of Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. Trump actually got the exact white average percentage from the 94 like average. Same thing with Kamala Harris getting around 42%. Kamala Harris actually got the expected black average of 83% of the black vote, while Trump actually did a few percentage points better, getting 16% of the black vote instead of 12. But with Hispanics have had been getting slightly less Democrat over time. There was a point where Bush was making some good gains with Hispanic voters, but then started trending back towards the Democrats. But just recently, Trump was able to get that percentage into the mid 40s, while Kamala did slightly worse than the Democrat average at 55%. And then Asian Americans have just been going all over the place. Asian Americans, believe it or not, have actually been getting more Democratic. And I think part of that has to just do with the fact that, you have a lot of the parental generation that maybe tends to be more socially conservative that move into the US, but then the next generation and the third generation tends to fall victim to like identity politics and those other types of variables. So that part of the Asian American kind of shift kind of doesn't surprise me. And people like to talk about how this candidate or that candidate kind of shifted the Atlanta suburbs, but Atlanta as a whole has actually been shifting left for a few decades now. As you can see here in 1984, even Fulton County was a tilt blue voting county, but then by 2000, you already starting to see some blue shading. And then you look at 2020, yeah, you could blame one candidate, but the thing about it is, you look at the black trends, you see that from 2016 to 2020 over here, the Atlanta and metropolitan areas were just getting a lot less white. It was getting a little bit more Hispanic. Same thing with Asian, especially in like this Gwinnett region right here. But then you just see all the black trends over here where it gets a lot heavier density. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the county by county breakdown. So Bartow County, I want to go over this county specifically first just because of the fact that even though it is kind of a stretch for Atlanta metropolitan areas, it is one of those rural counties, and it was kind of a good indicator in the sense that Trump was able to energize rural voters in the sense that instead of winning by like 20, 30 points, he was winning some of these rural counties by 50, 60, sometimes even 70%, whether it was in Georgia or like the Midwest. And you see that in like the 2000s, the GOP is winning by like 30s, the 40s, and then Trump was able to get it up to like the 50s. I mean, Romney was also winning it by the 50s too. And then Cherokee, you see this one as well. This one, it was kind of like on our plus 50 county, but then it is starting to get a little bit more blue. Well, I shouldn't say blue yet, but it is starting to shift more to the left. It's still like on our plus 38 county, but it has shifted on average 10 points to the left since 2000. And then Clayton County, it was D plus 32, and now it's all the way to almost D plus 70%. And then Cobb, this is the county that Cobb and Gwinnett in particular, these are the two counties that the current president gets blamed for flipping. But even before his era, you see that Cobb was actually getting a little less Republican in the 2000s. And believe it or not, Cobb was a county that voted for Reagan by R plus 50%. So like those trends were starting to continue. But then also too, I'm going to show you a few more counties that are more extreme cases, and I'll give you a little bit more details about that. And then so Douglas, you have Douglas. This one was an R plus 25, and then it actually flipped in the mid 2000s to D plus 1.83, where it's now a D plus 31% county. And this county this county flipped during the Bush years, and I do not blame Bush or John McCain for the split. And I don't think it's a good idea to always just try to blame a certain candidate. And that's because when you try to really examine the county, you have to look at, is the GOP as a whole actually doing that much worse with these different types of demographics, or are the demographics actually changing? And you saw that here with DeKalb, it just got a lot bluer. With Fayette was once a solid red county, and you see these percentages keep going down, and Fayette is on the verge of flipping into the blue column. You see Forsyth, it was once almost an R plus 60%, and now it's getting to like R plus 30. And you see Fulton was like a D plus 17, and now it's almost a D plus 45. Gwinnett, see it flipped. And then Hall has stayed relatively almost the same, actually. Henry was another county that flipped during the Romney-McCain transition. And then Paulding, I take that back. Hall didn't flip. It did flip in 2016, but I'll explain a little bit more about that. So then Paulding went from R plus 41 to R plus 24. And finally, this is the county I want to talk about. Rockdale County. This was an R plus 30 county, and it actually flipped during the Bush to McCain transition, and now it's a D plus 50%. It's easy to try to start blaming these county flips on certain politicians, but I don't blame it on certain politicians. I looked at it as, was the GOP doing that much worse with the white suburbanites or their base? And the reality situation is, in Rockdale County, so I don't have the 2000 graph with me, but if you look at the U.S. Census, Rockdale County 2000 to 2004, this was over 70%, close to 75% white when Bush won it both times. And then, as you can see, as it went from 2000 to 2010 to 2022, the white percentage has been going down drastically. It went from like almost 75% to 40.7% to now it's 24.3% in 22. Meanwhile, the black population has really exploded in this county. And it essentially went from having a demographic dominated that votes more Republican to now you have a demographic that is the dominant in this county that's voting over 85% Democrat. So you were going to see some sort of substantial swing. And this isn't just the story of Rockdale County. It's happening in Fayette. It started happening, trickling a little bit into Gwinnett, Cobb. And then also, too, you look at some of the other counties. That's honestly part of the reason why these counties had such a shift, and you saw those maps. In terms of turnout, the thing I think is fascinating actually is like if you look at Republican performances on the federal elections, like for example, like a Reagan or H.W. Bush, a lot of Republicans have had to rely on lower turnout, where the total U.S. turnout was about 50-ish%. Trump is actually the first Republican in decades, since I believe Richard Nixon, to actually win and thrive on higher turnout. And that kind of happened with him in the state of Georgia, where he had an abnormal turnout, especially during 2020, the COVID lockdowns, and yet he was still able to win with 60.1% turnout and 72.6%. And as expected, presidential years always have larger turnouts than midterms. It's rare for midterms to match the presidential numbers. You see, in the midterms, you had just under 4 million votes for 2022 and 2018, and you only had around 2.5 million votes for 2014. Meanwhile, in 2016, you had just under 4 million, but then by 2020, you had 5 million, and then 2024, you had 5,211,000. So between 24 and 20 versus their counterparts in 2022 and 2018, you had about 1 million more people voting in the presidential than the midterms. And I want to just go over this because I do think it's good that someone like Brian Kemp is able to do well and outperform the Republican average with white voters. He's getting 74%, which is about 20% better than the Republican average as a whole. But I will say Brian Kemp is actually doing worse than Republican average with black voters. You see it like he's getting 6, 9%. He's only getting single digits. Trump, percentage-wise, did not do that much worse than Brian Kemp with white voters, but he did have a few percentage points drop off, 69 to 71. But he is doing slightly better with black voters, 11 to 12%. But if I have to be transparent, these are still not good numbers with black voters if the GOP wants to stay sustainable in the state of Georgia in particular. And in terms of, I don't want to talk about this topic too much, but in terms of if Brian Kemp does decide to run in 2026, I look at the numbers as I think he would still have the best electability map for the GOP for like say like U.S. Senate just because he does overperform with at least one of the demographics. Meanwhile, a lot of other GOP candidates, I could see them doing slightly worse than the white voters, but then I don't see them making up for it with like the black or Hispanic populations. And the reason I didn't include Asian Americans in this chart is just because, again, Asian Americans they make up less than 5% of the Georgia population, and they make up less than 2% of registered voters. So they're not really moving the needle as much as like some of the other demographics. And I want to break this down. Even someone like Reagan, who is revered among the GOP in states like Georgia, Reagan was only getting 66% of the white vote versus Mondale, and he was getting single digits as well. So it's not unusual to see Republican candidates to underperform with black voters. And to be honest, there's not many Republicans in recent times that have done well with black voters outside of some of the more moderate Republican governors, say like a Massachusetts governor like Charlie Baker or Larry Hogan in Maryland. And according to the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 7 states that are majority minority states right now: Hawaii, New Mexico, California, Texas, Nevada, Maryland, and Georgia. Georgia, once again, is actually an anomaly here. Georgia is actually the one of the only states on this list that isn't a majority minority state because of its Hispanic population. It's a majority minority state because of its African American population. You see states like New Mexico, the reason why the GOP hasn't had any luck yet flipping it back is just because when Bush won it, believe it wasn't yet at the majority minority states. But I mean, with a state like New Mexico, the day when the GOP can finally win the Hispanic vote, instead of just getting almost 50-50, is a day I think New Mexico has a very good chance of flipping into the GOP column. I mean, they did that with Nevada. But with Georgia, what makes it tricky is the GOP as a whole, they're not getting anywhere close to the black percentages that they need. And in terms of my analysis on the 2024 election, I was actually kind of surprised that Trump won the state of Georgia because I made a 6-month projection where I had Trump winning Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and I even had him winning Nevada just because of the registration trends and the trends of how it was moving right comparatively to the last few election cycles. But the reason why I had Trump losing Georgia is because it became a majority minority state, and the GOP is just not has not really done a lot to make gains with the black voter turnout the last few decades. And one of the things I noticed is black early voting turnout was down to around 26% instead of the normal 30% range. I mean, African Americans make up 34% of the population in the state of Georgia right now, and they make up about like 30-ish% in terms of registered voters. So for the fact of the matter is, Trump won the state of Georgia by just over 100,000 voters, and each percentage where that voter turnout was down, you apply the 83% Democrat, 12% are in if it had been normal African American turnout, Trump could have narrowly lost the state of Georgia again. And 2024 was actually the first year that Georgia came in as a majority minority state. And so you see here are the demographics. In the 1990s, Georgia was a very white state, 71%, but then you see these numbers go down to 65, 59 to 53, and then finally in 2023, it was at 49.6. Meanwhile, you're starting to see a big bump with African American voters, 27 to 29, close to 29, 30, 32, and now 33.2. And I think in the next decade or two, I could see a situation where African American voters get close to 40%, if not 40%. And also, too, Asian Americans about 5%, so they did go up a little bit, and the Hispanics as well. They've been roughly about the 10% margin. But I will say, too, it's always dependent on what happens because you never know. 2022, 2024, African Americans sat at home, most likely because they may have felt frustrated with Biden, Kamala Harris, and some of the environment, or the trends could reverse itself or something happens. But like when I make this projection, it's more or less just I'm just basing it off like how the trends are going right now. So I did some basic math. So let's say we had a 40% African American with average white performance. So I did, the 85% that Democrats normally get with black voters, 13% for Republican, 41% for white Democrats, 56 for white Republicans, 55 for Democrats, and 43 for Hispanics. These are just based off the averages, and just off of this alone, you start adding these numbers in, and then just off of white and so this is black, this is white. Just off of white and black voters alone, in this scenario, the Democrat candidate is already at close to 53% of the vote. The election's already over. And then you add in Hispanics, it's about 57.5%. But then the thing about it is the GOP, they are doing slightly better with white voters, but they're also doing worse than black voters. And then I did a better case scenario where, let's say we're getting like Kemp White numbers. The numbers get a little bit better, but then even then you start adding in Hispanics, assume that it's getting close to 50-50 for Hispanics. The Democrat is still getting over 50% of the vote just off the bat. And we haven't even added like two race or Asian Americans. And so in this regard, it's one of those situations where if the GOP doesn't start doing better with African American voters, it may become a situation where they could start seeing even more losses in the state. So we see here from the national perspective, the U.S. as a whole is becoming a lot more diverse as well. So like whites, for most of U.S. history, white Americans made up more than 80% of the votes. But now, as you can see, they're actually getting close to the 55%, maybe even 50% margin. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised in the next few decades we do see that just because the next generation is about to become more diverse. Meanwhile, all the other minority groups are starting to make up a bigger percentage. And we see that also too, as of 2011, minority births are majority births among nationwide. And in 2017, minority children comprise the majority in 14 states. The 7 we just talked about, and then 7 more include Arizona, Florida, New Jersey, Delaware, Alaska, New York, and Mississippi. As of 2019, children are the majority minority nationwide. Many political analysts thought not long ago that the GOP was in for some rough election cycles in the coming decades because Democrats have always overperformed with African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asians. The only demographic the Republicans have generally done well with is white voters. And you also see too, from a religion standpoint, during the 70s to 80s, you saw that almost 90% of the population was Christian. So not only were they white, but they were also Christian. So you had a very homogeneous population. But as you can see, the Christian percentage really goes down as the decades come up. But then also too, you see that other religions, for example, as the U.S. gets more diverse, you have other religions starting to make a little bit more of a presence, like Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, whatnot, Sikhism, and then also to a rise in secularism as well. And if the trends continue, Pew Research predicts that the Christian population in the next few decades could get to like in the 30% range. So that is something that the GOP should keep in mind, that they're going to be dealing most likely with less and less Bible Belt voters if the trends continue. And then this was just a shift from the New York Times of all the red shifts, blue shifts. I do know a lot of people have already seen this. We see a lot of blue dots in Georgia, and I'm going to explain more about that. And the thing about it is, do say people really need to be careful when they look at maps like this, because these maps are based off a percentage of voter turnout. That doesn't necessarily mean that it just shifted more Republican as a total vote wide, just because the fact that, say you had a few 100,000 voters show up in this county, but then it may have shifted right from 2020 percentage wise, but it might have actually been just because there were less people overall turning out from both sides. So it might have not actually shifted that much right or left. In terms of 2016 to 2024, Georgia was actually an anomaly once again here. A lot of from the beginning of the Trump era to the start of the next Trump era, a lot of the swing states actually shifted right, but Georgia actually shifted left by 3%, which I kind of expected just because of the changing demographics of the state. And then you see here the 10 biggest county shifts for Democrats for Republicans in the year 2024. I'm honestly surprised there's not a single county here from New Jersey, considering how much it shifted. But you see a lot of red shifts in the states of Texas, a few in New York, Bronx, Queens, both shifted by over 20 points. You had one in California. There were more in California and New Jersey, but they just didn't make the top 10. But then for Georgia, or for the biggest Democrat shifts, out of the 10, almost half of them actually came from Georgia. And I'm going to tell you this right now. When you look at this, Matt, when you look at this table, Alice, Oklahoma, this is actually more of a rural county. And to be honest, this is one of those counties where Republicans were already kind of maxing out. So a 4.87% shift isn't like too bad for the Republicans. It might have just been some Republicans that just didn't like Trump that sat at home. But Paulding, Douglas, Rockdale, Henry, these are all Atlanta metropolitan suburban counties in the state of Georgia. So the fact that these four all shifted left, that is pretty big of a blow to the GOP in that state. But then also too is just the fact that it's kind of a testament that it was actually kind of a miracle that Trump was able to win Georgia in that regard, despite all the leftward shifts in some of these suburban counties. And so, like, my analysis shows that Trump was able to win because, again, Black African Americans just did not turn out this election like they normally do. But he does what he does best in the sense that he was able to run up the numbers in the rural areas, and he did slightly better in some of the minority communities despite the leftward shift. However, the the better performance with the minority communities wasn't, in my opinion, like that substantial. It's not like you saw like a 10% increase. Atlanta being one of the fastest growing cities with a demographic that currently does not favor the GOP, it will be difficult to squeeze out much more rural votes as Trump already maxed out the numbers in many of these counties. Regardless of who the candidate is, the GOP is going to need to do a better job in the state of Georgia, in particularly to get a better share of the black vote if they want to keep the state red, given the trends. And if I had to be honest, my projection that I have right now, I think in the next decade or two, I think the GOP is probably going to lose Georgia if things continue. I think Georgia will go from a purple state to like a blue leaning state because I could see Fayette County flipping and I could see Cherokee or Forsyth getting a little bit more purple. And now this is the reapportionment map. You see that if trends continue by 2030, these are states that, if it's in green, it means it's going to gain electoral vote. If it's in red, it's going to lose electoral vote. So you see California, New York, they're going to lose 4 and 3 electoral votes respectively. It's pretty much all blue states except for the state of Pennsylvania. And then it's a lot of red states that are going to gain electoral votes. So that's actually going to be better for the GOP candidate who runs in 2032. I think a lot of these states have potential to stay in the GOP column. The only one I think would be a concern for the GOP right now is the state of Georgia. And these were my projections for U.S. states. These are not flipped to the other party. These are just, I think these states are former reliably Republican or Democrat states, or currently are, and I could see them shifting to the other side. New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Minnesota, Hawaii, just because of different factors. Like, for example, New York has had some of the worst population losses for the 5 borough counties, and if you look at the numbers closely, New York City has shifted right now for 4 or 5 election cycles, and then Oregon just has kind of a demographic that the GOP has been making gains on. If I had to be frank, out of the Republican states that are that are around right now, I have to say Georgia's probably at the top, and states I could see having most likely to shift. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Have any questions, feedback, please let me know.